have a question for you. How hard is it for you to take initiative on something that you know will be extraordinarily unpopular? On January 21st, the German newspaper Der Spiegel cited an intelligence report from the German Federal Intelligence Service, the BND. It was claiming that, in a phone conversation on January 21st, President Xi over in China asked World Health Organization Director General Tedros to, quote, delay a global warning about the virus. That was on January 21st. Okay, that is really an interesting accusation, if true, that the president of China wanted that to be delayed. Now, we don't have confirmation on that, but it is from the BND. On January 23rd, China began the quarantine of Wuhan City. In between those 2 days, United States Senator Tom Cotton analyzed the essence of the developing news leaks out of East Asia and was struck by what he later called deceit and dishonesty. So do you see this picture? Late January, China begins making these moves. We get a little bit of a buzz from German intelligence, and then this quarantine begins. And U.S. Senator Tom Cotton is watching and thinking about this. And this is during a time when the impeachment trial, or impeachment circus rather, was going on in Washington, D.C. And he was thinking about something extraordinarily important or potentially important. And so this Arkansas senator took quick and decisive leadership and initiative on the situation by sending a letter to Secretary of Health and Human Services Alex Azar, encouraging the Trump administration to consider banning travel between China and the United States and warning that the communist regime could be covering up how dangerous the disease really was. Now, okay, that's a pretty bold move. That's a pretty bold initiative. Tom Cotton was dead on target in his instincts and his actions. He modeled the kind of foresight and initiative citizens should be able to expect from their leaders. And what I'm doing on this podcast is trying to inspire and help and equip listeners out there to rise up and be the leaders in the local community who can be depended on, who are trustworthy. And here we have an example of a guy, a United States senator, who's in a position, to directly contact the president or the cabinet, the president's cabinet, and say, hey, let's do something. You have access to Department of, all the departments to do things that could be protecting the health of American citizens, including even shutting down travel. So when the first classified briefing on the virus was held in the Senate on January 24th, only 14 senators reportedly showed up because guess what was dominating the news cycle? Well, it was that impeachment trial. Senator Cotton continued to look into the situation, and his public and private warnings became more urgent that last week of January. In a January 28th letter to the Secretaries of State and Health and Human Services and Homeland Security, he noted that, quote, no amounts of screening at airports will identify a contagious but asymptomatic person afflicted with the coronavirus. And he's right. I mean, he looked into the epidemiology enough just to know, hey, this is how these viruses work. And if China has got one and it's really dangerous and it's killing people, what do we do to protect our country? Who's looking after our borders? Well, this is one of my duties of care, duties of responsibility as a United States Senator. And I'm going to speak up about this. Now, Cotton called for an immediate evacuation of Americans in China and a ban on all commercial flights between China and the United States. And he then first spoke to President Trump about the virus the next day. He's not resting. He's not waiting. He is making things happen. And it's interesting that the biggest newspaper back in his home state criticized him for missing nearly 3 hours of the impeachment trial while he was discussing the matter with Trump administration officials. They're trying to find something to criticize him about, and they still do. And there will be people who criticize this podcast for what he did, but I'm trying to point out that he was watching something carefully and then taking initiative on things that could have helped protect Americans while we looked a little bit deeper into the nature of this virus. Okay. In an interview with National Review, Cotton, on January 31st, the president announced a limited ban on travel. And Cotton points out that the president did not have many advisors at that point encouraging him to shut down travel. And that's true. I mean, the president needs good advisors. And if he doesn't have them, those of us who might have access to him or might have access to your local governor or your local mayor or your local police chief, are you using whatever influence you have to try to speak up to give the very best guidance and advice that you possibly can after doing necessary study? And Tom Cotton did that. He did not shoot from the hip. I can't go into all that he did, but he really did look into this at a medical level. He did look into this at a security level. Advisors who were supportive of the president and supportive of ending travel tended to be national security aides, he adds, while most of his economic and public health advisors were ambivalent at best about the travel ban. Why is that? I mean, the public health advisors should have been the ones to know that, yes, you can't let a virus like that into your country. You've got to do the very best to keep the viral load out of your country. Tom Cotton says, I commend the president greatly for ultimately making the right decision, contrary to what the so-called experts were telling him. And so another example of leadership I want to point out is another representative. He's the Representative Tom Massey from Kentucky. In early April, he could see that America was only weeks, not months, away from farmers euthanizing animals that would have been sold for meat and food. His tweet, that was his tweet. He said, we're weeks, not months away. His tweet also accurately predicted that fruits and vegetables are going to rot in the fields. A drastic change in policy this week could ameliorate this inevitability. And as a consequence of his warnings, there were some amendments to regulations, but not nearly enough. What I want to point out is that this representative from Kentucky, has been trying to do something about a weakness that he can see in our regulations. Since early 2019, Tom Massey has been pushing for legislation in H.R. 2859 that would solve what he believes are some of the underlying issues with the food supply chain. Why, he says, is the price of meat going up in the supermarkets and the price of cattle going down at the auction ring? It's because our supply line is brittle. You have to take cattle, steer, beef, whatever, hogs to a processing plant. And these processing plants, like much of industrial America right now, are shutting down because of absentees, which has been exacerbated by the unemployment program the federal government has instituted. So he's trying to see these problems, look at them, evaluate them, determine then what needs to be done about them. He continued to say he's afraid that farmers will go bankrupt and that the cattle and hogs will be euthanized or incinerated and buried while there are shortages at the market. And this is true. I just checked yesterday, and in our area, there are pretty severe shortages of all kinds of food, but especially of meat in the supermarkets. Massey goes on, and you talk about civil unrest when you start seeing that. And it's all because of the brittle food supply chain, he added. And so, what can we learn from this? Crisis leadership, like that seen in Cotton and Massey, is simply the bold and decisive and responsible reaction to a set of facts honestly studied. This is what we need to learn from and model ourselves.
If you like content like this, please consider subscribing. If you know others who would benefit from this material, please share it with them. To connect with us directly, please visit geoffreybotkin.com and send any questions or thoughts that you might have to questions@geoffreybotkin.com.